This is 10 Guys You Should Know on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The chapter begins with the narrative of Bonhoeffer's public radio broadcast in 1933, which was abruptly cut off. This featured Bonhoeffer at age 26, uh, barely days after the election of Adolf Hitler, and Bonhoeffer speaking on the subject of the Führer and how the Führer has a potential to become their Führer. So it was direct critique of the leadership of that time, and Bonhoeffer specifically also said these words: "Those who set themselves up as God mock God." So a direct critique, a direct attack on the leadership of his day with reference to God. We know that that was a very ominous sign of how things would pan out for Bonhoeffer. Particularly, this event actually captured his criticism against the Führer principle, the concept of the Führer of his time, namely the regime of Hitler and his political ideals. That was just one of many events that demonstrated his public collision course against the Nazis. So we go back to the beginning of the life of Bonhoeffer, noting that he was born in 1906 as a twin with his sister, who were the sixth and seventh of eight children born to Paula and Karl Bonhoeffer. They are a high-profile family, given that Karl, for example, was a psychiatrist and professor at University of Berlin, while Paula was, as a wife, was a university graduate, which was rare for women in those times. His maternal grandfather also served as a court preacher for Kaiser Wilhelm II. With this, we can see that his social standing is somewhat of the higher side, and that's just his parents. Dietrich's siblings included a professor of chemistry, Carl Friedrich, Klaus, who was a lawyer, however, who would meet his downfall after a failed execution attempt to kill Hitler, and Walter, who died in 1918 on the Western Front due to war. With that in mind, Bonhoeffer's pathway toward becoming a theologian was still somewhat surprising, considering the social context of pastors during those times. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family was part of the cultured and elite privileged group people, but they were not especially religious. Given that the church was characterized by as a petite bourgeois institution, that is to say, lower middle class people that included vocations like small business owners and artisans. Hence, we see here the unlikeliness of Bonhoeffer's vocational choice. He's definitely on course to become somewhat of a high academic, to study in university or to become a doctorate holder or of that sort. And even his father commented that Dietrich was potentially selling himself short in choosing such a pathway. Nonetheless, reflecting back on Dietrich's life, his father remarked that he thought his life would be quiet and uneventful. But as for uneventful, he said that he was greatly mistaken. I think we all knew how Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life ended, and this reflected the expectations that Dietrich's life didn't really turn out the way that it was expected, given the path that he was going into ministry, into a quiet life, into a life that is away from all the public, uh, all the public involvement and all of that. But that didn't really pan out the way that Karl Bonhoeffer expected later on. So we note once again Dietrich born in 1906, Breslau. It's a pair of twins. The next timeline that we had here in Dietrich's life, of course, on top of the loss of his elder brother, 1918, Walter, his next milestone was 1923, where he began to study theology at Tübingen. So this was the absolutely like quiet or uneventful period, maybe the last of them. But yeah, so there was little hint of the tumultuous events to come during this phase. He transferred to the University of Berlin a year later, and at age 21, he completed his doctorate. The dissertation, it was entitled Communion of the Saints, Sanctorum Communal. Why was this remarkable? Because it was praised to be a theological miracle by eminent Swiss theologian Karl Barth. So as we noted at the very beginning of the chapter, Dietrich was very much a precocious, and that means a sort of a wonderkind figure, somebody who was prodigious and smart and a genius from a very young age, precociously talented. Well, we proceed now that um, Dietrich was a doctor of theology. He almost immediately plugged into his role as a pastor. So we know that he comes from a privileged background, but he didn't miss out on being a practical theologian, as well as his care for the marginalized and oppressed, which would characterize his heart for ministry. As is noted here, immediately after graduation, he served as an assistant pastor in a Lutheran church for German expatriates in Spain, 1928 and 1929. This was a time of the Great Depression as well, where Bonhoeffer would consider or would look into abject poverty. So he would be exposed to abject poverty during this time. And this was a period when he began to preach to those who were wealthy, well-to-do in his congregation to help or minimally to acknowledge the existence of those disadvantaged locals in their midst. Dietrich was also characterized as a well-traveled person. Later on in 1930 to 31, he would find himself traveling down to New York as a recipient of a scholarship at UTS. This would prove to be a very impactful period for him on numerous fronts. Firstly, he would have experienced his own personal conversion. Later on, he recounts, something happened, something that has changed and transformed my life to the present day. For the first time I discovered the Bible, I had often preached. I had seen a great deal of the church and talked and preached about it, but I had not yet become a Christian. Since then, everything has changed. So we note here how Bonhoeffer had come to experience, in a very real sense, his own faith for the first time. during that period when he was in New York. Because there is no explicit statement about whether Bonhoeffer had struggled with his inner consciousness, sin, or anything of that sort. Nonetheless, it was during this time that he, in his late 20s, where he would experience personal conversion. Second, he come to feel indignant about the loss of orthodoxy in theological liberalism. So Protestant had been impacted by theological liberalism. We could see the presence of this in the period of Charles Spurgeon as well. And now in the time of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer began to express his own dissatisfaction. This dates back to an event in New York when he attended a seminar about Luther's bondage, the bondage of the will. So a public lecture of Luther's The Bondage of the Will. And people were not being very serious about it. They began to laugh at it and didn't really take things very seriously. The other thing to note here, he says a fellow German, and that is with reference clearly to Luther. Yeah. So they seem to make light the subject of sin, forgiveness, and atonement, and the gospel during this lecture, which incurred the dissatisfaction, indignation, and wrath of Bonhoeffer. Thirdly, he began to become close to an African American fellow student named Frank Fisher. And this is the time when he would witness firsthand systemic racism, which would roll over into his observation of Germany during its anti-Semitic period. So with these three learning points in America, he would find himself quickly having the opportunity to act or to react to these insights. The next time he would return to uh, Germany and accept a position to be a lecturer of theology. At the same time, he's ordained as a Lutheran pastor. So all this in Germany. We know that during this time, the political climate was also undergoing seismic convulsions, changing very drastically. Specifically, this is a post-World War I context on the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was heavily punished, and their honor was being put to shame. This was also a time when they began to give ears to a man that needs no introduction, Adolf Hitler. He began rising in popularity, cashing in on the vulnerability of the German citizens and with a promise of a better future under his leadership. Within months of his power, Hitler in 1933 enacted legislation that gave Nazi unilateral power. Anti-Semitism was also embedded into the legislation as well. And one of the laws included the law for the restoration of the civil service, which had the famous Aryan clause. That is to say, Jews could not hold position of authority, government, universities, and also in the church. The Nazi edicts did not just impacted the country at a macro level, but one of Bonhoeffer's friends, Franz Hildebrand, was a Lutheran pastor of Jewish descent, who would be impacted as well. So that really hit pretty close to Bonhoeffer. From that time on, Bonhoeffer began to hit back. and the new German and Nazi laws. How so? So in April 1933, delivered a lecture, The Church and the Jewish Question. This directly contradicted the state order. The sermon consisted of three instructions. Firstly, Christians are to question whether the state actions are legitimate, throwing the state back on its responsibilities. Secondly, the church can help the victims of the state action. So there's really some indirect contradiction. The state does this persecution to persecute a certain group of people, and then but the citizens or Christians have have a kind of a responsibility to help those people who were sidelined by the government. Cited Galatians 6:2 in evoking the Christians to help out those who have become disadvantaged by state action. Thirdly, and this is the most radical one, he says it's not just to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to put a spoke in the wheel itself, to be an engine to stand in the way of state action to the point of martyrdom. So other prominent figures that walked alongside Bonhoeffer included Karl, which we noted just now from Switzerland, and Pastor Martin Niemöller. He quickly found himself as part of a dissenting group of Christians who refused to submit to the authority of the day. But they became part of a church known as the Confessing Church. 1934, they produced the Barmen Declaration. Barmen specifically is a city in Wuppertal, Germany. It repudiated the Führer principle, so it stood against the state. By that time, they were already somewhat of a spoke in the wheel of the state from at a more at a wider level. It also rejected the totalitarian claims of Nazism. And also, they rejected the idea that the church can turn over the form of a message and ordinances at will, or according to some dominant ideological and political convictions. During that time, the state was exerting propaganda that the church could become an organ or vehicle of the state. In so doing, the Barmen Confession opposes the control of the state over church matters, pitting the church against the state. The church, in other words, can uphold their own ideology apart from the nation in the face of the state's radical position. And yet, Bonhoeffer foresaw that this would not be the last point of resistance in jamming the machinery of the state. He said this to a friend, April 1934. While I'm working with the church opposition with all my might, it's perfectly clear to me that this opposition is only a very temporary transitional phase on the way to an opposition of a very different kind. And he was very prophetic, very accurate in so-called foreseeing the coming resistance to the point of shedding blood and suffering through such terrible time of persecution. All that being said, the pastor underwent many difficulties and struggled in his surrender to wholeheartedly toward this cause. In late 1933, he had the opportunity to flee from Germany to pastor two German-speaking churches in London. So with that, he found a sort of a safe haven or shelter to flee from the resistance work. But he didn't manage to do that for long. His friend Calbart would be pestering him, asking him about his work in Germany. How can you run away from this work? He also doubled down in saying, now is not the time for you to be an Elijah under the juniper tree or Jonah under the gourd. You must shoot from both barrels. You cannot leave behind the machine gun that is in Germany. And he further probes Bonhoeffer. How about the German church? How about the German church? So was very insistent that Bonhoeffer wasn't in the right place, wasn't in the right location, the right locale. So with all that is being said, how could Bonhoeffer stay any much longer? By 1935, Bonhoeffer gave in and surrendered. He went back to Germany. Now he joined he's part of the confessing church where he became Brother Bonhoeffer as as a professor in this church seminar underground church seminary. During this time, he began to solidify many of his discipleship paradigms. He taught them things like it isn't enough to confess your sins to God. We need to confess our secret sins to one another. Not to let any secret sin fester, because it gnaws away at us and poisons us. Sin creates detritus in the soul. Must get the serpent to stick out its head so that it can be whacked. And he also presented another really insightful point. The root of all sin is pride. And the solution to this is to confess to one another, to break this arrogance, to subject oneself to a discomfort. But this discomfort would in turn save one's soul, would be a remedy for the poison of the sin. More specifically, Bonhoeffer continues, since Adam dies a disgraceful death in great agony, we would rather bypass it and think it's enough to just confess it to God and continue going with our lives. But if we confess our sins, we are imitating the act of discipleship to the cross. And through the cross, we gain freedom from pride or flesh or reason. This season was not long drawn but short lived. So we see the downward decline of Bonhoeffer in these years as the state began to assert its action against Bonhoeffer. It began to become a direct enemy of the regime and to the point of even Hitler himself. We shall recall in some detail here. 1936, he was declared a pacifist and enemy of the state. 1937, the confessing church was outlawed, seminary shut down, and Bonhoeffer students arrested. 1938, banned from lecturing at the University of Berlin. 1940, forbidden to speak in public. 1941, rights to publish was revoked, even though he was willing to say the words Heil Hitler to show his patriotism to the state. In the next, we consider Bonhoeffer's major seminal work, which is none other than The Cost of Discipleship, or in German, it's simply called Nachfolge, which means discipleship, written in 1937. In the foreword to the book, one of the editors began to quote Bonhoeffer, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. In the course of discipleship, Bonhoeffer began to talk about how Christians have become complacent and cozy up to and submit to political powers as a way to expand the prestige of the church. So we like to build institutions rather than to build our inner life. We were marveling at becoming powerful, becoming rich, rather than to become more Christ-like. Course of Discipleship presented a challenging paradigm to live out the radical demands focused on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The theology within is the contrast between true or costly grace versus counterfeit or otherwise cheap grace. Bonhoeffer's Course of Discipleship presents the most clearest definition to this notion of cheap grace, which remains a very relevant topic for us today in light of many of the health, wealth, prosperity gospels that are being advocated among evangelical and Protestant circles. Bonhoeffer defines cheap grace. What is cheap grace? It is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. In practice, a person says, I can go on and sin as much as I like. Rely on this grace to forgive me. It is a grace that provides no assurance that the grace of God will cover that believer. It is believing but not living according to that belief. Believing without discipleship. Bonhoeffer spells it out in capital letters. This grace, this form of cheap grace is the deadly enemy of the church. We are fighting today for costly grace. Cheap grace reduces grace to a doctrine, a principle, a system. Cheap grace rejects God. In contrast to that, it is costly grace because it is true discipleship, calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It takes the life of a man, but it's the only one that can give true life. It truly condemns sin and it justifies the sinner. And last of all, it is costly because God gave his son to pay the price for such a grace. A person who was truly forgiven in God's sight would not misuse this forgiveness as license to indulge in sin. He reaffirmed a crucial theological insight of the Reformation. Here I'm guessing it is the idea of the theology of the cross. Justification by grace alone, through faith alone. Christians aren't simply saved from sin, but for discipleship, costly one, to follow Jesus Christ himself. So far from dispensing the justified Christian from discipleship, this grace only made him a more earnest disciple. As a result, those who try to use this grace as a dispensation from following Christ are simply deceiving themselves. In the next section, we shall see Bonhoeffer briefly wavering, but eventually living out his call to finally be a martyr for the faith. So the state began to double down on its policies, becoming more malevolent. That included a wave of violent attacks on Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses. Bonhoeffer spoke out against the flagrant anti-Semitism, and he faced the irritation of the Nazi regime. He then added, only those who cry out for the Jews can sing Gregorian chants. In his Bible, he also underlined the verse Psalm 74:8. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. Beside it, he wrote 9.11.38, the date when the Nazi regime began to burn down the house of the Jews and began to accelerate their persecution against them. Then he also added exclamation mark to the following verse. We do not see our signs, there is no longer any prophet, and there is none among us who knows how long. And as mentioned just now, he had this temptation to flee from the danger or the persecution that is to come to him. And he did that in 1938 when he left Germany for the US and returned very shortly after in 1939. For Bonhoeffer, he could not participate in this revolution while being in a position of comfort. He couldn't do this from a distance. He couldn't be sort of like an armchair theologian, but he had to share in the trials with his people because he saw the dangers that were to come and that was going to affect the people. Bonhoeffer knew that he had to make a resolute stand for his nation, the Christians, the Jews, and the people of Germany. During this phase, Bonhoeffer also became a double agent, where he became privy to the knowledge of some plots to assassinate Hitler, such as Operation 7. And such knowledge can actually condemn him. So it came all the way to a point where Bonhoeffer was eventually arrested by the Gestapo. He entered Tegel prison, and that was the final 2 years of his life. He was engaged to be married to a woman, but that was not to be realized since he would be incarcerated and executed later on. In his prison years, he kept himself engaged in Bible reading, prayer, singing hymns that he had memorized. He also continued writing. One of the works included letters and papers from prison, where he reflected on the central place of suffering in Christianity. To be Christian, he reflected, does not mean to be religious in a particular way, to make something of oneself on the basis of some method or other, but to be a man, not a type of man, but the man that Christ creates in us. It is not a religious act that makes the Christian, but participation in the sufferings of God in the secular life. This is perhaps very true to life for Bonhoeffer. Was at that point at the brink of his, or at the peak of his suffering and pain. Even Bonhoeffer's writings reflected a very practical form of theology, particularly on his reflections in the participation of suffering. This was definitely contrasted with high-minded theology that is all in the head and has no practical implications on one's life at all. Bonhoeffer's execution will be initiated by a failed assassination attempt, where they will quickly gather the conclusion that Bonhoeffer was a co-conspirator. Eventually, he was charged with high treason and executed. In fact, in Tegel, he actually contemplated suicide, not for the reason of a consciousness of guilt, but because he was already dead. I think that's open to some interpretation, but it could mean that though he had already fully surrendered himself, he was already spiritually dead in that sense. His heart was dead. He had given up fighting already. Not yet. His hope has died and all of that. Finally, we remark on Bonhoeffer's final days and legacy. I don't suppose anyone can deny the continued influence of Bonhoeffer, particularly his book, The Cost of Discipleship, which presents us a very challenging paradigm, both in terms of the words that we read, as well as in the witness that Bonhoeffer himself continues to present, and which is a very challenging one, the one that follows Christ, who calls the man to come and die with Christ. Just to cite maybe a quote from Martin Luther King, who said that if your opponent has a conscience, then follow Gandhi and non-violence. But if your enemy has no conscience, like Hitler, then follow Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was really dealt a kind of a very bad hand as opposed to Gandhi. Yeah. And he suffered a ton of injustice for the cause for which he stood. But even as he wavered minorly at times, overall his life presents to us a paradigm of full surrender of one's life to the point of death that exhorts us, that encourages us in our journey of faith and suffering. Indeed, as is said here, there's an added mystic because of the sudden ending of Bonhoeffer's relatively short life. He's come to follow Christ, but to a point of having his life prematurely terminated, whereas he demonstrated so much talent and potential in his younger years. His peak was not to last beyond a decade and a half. It was noted that Bonhoeffer continued to pastor while he was in the concentration camp, and even had the opportunity to preach a sermon from Isaiah 53:5. As we know, his final minutes, he had a perfunctory trial in the evening in the camp's laundry room, and he was sentenced to death for high treason. There was a symbolic reversal of that trial, as exactly 50 years later, the charges were being reversed by the government. In fact, after Bonhoeffer's death, in a matter of weeks, Hitler would commit suicide and end the war that he had started. The following will consist of detailed narrative of the final hour of Bonhoeffer's life when he was sentenced to death with 6 other co-resistors to be hanged. One of the last people who saw him was a doctor who described himself as initially not knowing who this man was, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He said that Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison garb, knelt on the floor and prayed fervently to his God. An act that deeply moved this doctor. So it demonstrated a faith that was so devout, so certain that God had heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a prayer, and then climbed to the steps to the gallows, brave and composed, and then died in the next few seconds. He said that in the almost 50 years as a prison doctor, he had hardly seen a man die so entirely submitted to the will of God. These were the last of Bonhoeffer's words. This is the end for me, the beginning of life. With that, we end the chapter on Bonhoeffer and end this series of reading summaries on 10 dead guys you should know. Bye bye.